Welcome, traveler. I am the Herald.
The hull should not have been warm. Salvaged Thuron had cut into 11,000 wrecks in his life as a salvager, and every one of them, without exception, had greeted his cutting torch with the cold, dead silence of a corpse. Metal that had drifted for centuries did not hum. It did not tick with residual heat. It did not, under any circumstance a Varanth engineer could name, pulse faintly beneath his gloved hand like something sleeping. This one did. He floated in the debris shadow of a nameless brown dwarf, 40 light years past the edge of any chart the compact bothered to maintain, and he stared at the reading on his wrist display until the number stopped making sense. 11 degrees above ambient, rising, on a ship that, according to every scan he had run, had been drifting derelict for at least 400 years. "Say something useless, Ridge," he muttered into his comm. "Tell me I'm imagining it." Ridge, his cargo skiff's threadbare navigation intelligence, answered in the clipped, unbothered tone Kale had paid extra for specifically because it never tried to comfort him. "You are not imagining it. The hull is generating heat from an internal source. I recommend leaving." "You recommend leaving from every wreck. You recommended leaving from the fuel tanker that made us 4 months of eating money. That tanker did not have heat signatures consistent with an active reactor housed inside a 400-year-old hull of unknown alloy," Ridge said. "This one does." Kale drifted closer anyway, because he was a salvager 3 payments behind on a loan he'd taken out to keep his mother's clinic running on Threll Anchorage, and because unknown alloy meant unknown value, and because some small, stupid, curious part of him, the part that had made him terrible at every other career his family had wanted for him, could not look away from a ship shaped like nothing he had ever cut open before. It was long, impossibly long for something with no visible drive flare, no docking collars, no manufacturer markings in any of the 11 trade scripts he could read. The hull plating ran in smooth, unbroken curves instead of the riveted honeycomb panels every civilized species built with, as if it had been grown rather than assembled. And near the aft third, half buried under 4 centuries of drifted ice and dust, a section of the hull had peeled back in a long, jagged wound, exposing a corridor that should have been vacuum black and was instead, faintly, unmistakably, lit. "Ridge, tell me you see the light." "I see the light," Ridge said, and for the first time in 3 years of working together, something in its voice had gone very quiet. "Kale, I am recommending with unusual sincerity that we leave." He didn't leave. He told himself it was the debt. He told himself it was the reactor signature, worth more alone than his skiff. He did not let himself examine, too closely, the other reason that he had grown up on stories, the way every Varanth child had, of the vanished ones, the species that built ships like cathedrals, and then disappeared from the galaxy in the span of a single generation, leaving nothing behind but wrecks that made every other civilization's proudest technology look like a child's toy. He had never believed the stories were literally true. He had never expected to find one floating dead in the dark, still faintly warm. He suited up. He told Ridge to keep the skiff at a safe distance and hold a return vector hot. He took his cutting torch, his scanner, and against his better judgment, the small pry bar his father had given him before he died, the one with the Thuron family mark worn into the grip from 3 generations of hands. He remembered, as he cycled the skiff's tiny airlock, the last real conversation he'd had with his mother before he left Threll Anchorage on this run. She had not asked him to be careful. She never did. She had asked him, instead, whether he still believed in anything out here in the dark besides the next payment, and he had not had a good answer for her, and the silence between them had said more than either of them wanted it to. He thought of that silence now, drifting toward a hull that should not have been warm, and wondered, not for the first time, whether curiosity was a virtue or simply the shape his fear took when it had nowhere else to go. The debris field itself told its own quiet story, if a salvager knew how to read it. Most wrecks Kale cut into were surrounded by the telltale scatter of violence, hull fragments blasted outward in a cone, drive plumes froze in mid-burn, the kind of wreckage pattern that spoke of a fight lost quickly and badly. This field was different. The debris here drifted in slow, almost deliberate orbits around the central wreck, as if the ship itself had drawn the wreckage of some older, unrelated catastrophe into its gravity and simply kept it, the way a person might keep old letters in a drawer they never opened. Nothing about the turn matched any combat signature in his training. It looked less like a battlefield and more like a grave someone had tended. The corridor swallowed his suit lights and gave almost nothing back. The walls were a pale material that was neither metal nor stone, warm to the touch through his gloves, faintly luminous along seams that ran the length of the passage like veins. There was no dust inside, which made no sense for a wreck this old, and no debris, no bodies, no signs of the violence that must have torn the hull open from the outside. It was simply empty and clean and waiting. He found the chamber at the end of the corridor because the light led him there, growing brighter with every step, until he stood in a circular room with a raised dais at its center. And on that dais, a shape like a folded seed the size of a ground car, its surface etched with lines of characters that shifted, very slightly, as if breathing. "Kale," Ridge said in his ear, urgent now. "I am reading a power spike inside that chamber. Whatever that object is, it is drawing energy. I strongly advise." The seed unfolded. It did not explode outward or snap open with mechanical violence. It simply bloomed, petal by petal in absolute silence, until what had been a folded shape became an open lattice of light suspended a meter above the dais. And inside that lattice, a voice spoke, not through his suit comm, not through any frequency his scanner could identify, but somehow directly into the space behind his ears, in a language he did not know and understood perfectly anyway. "Unauthorized entry logged," the voice said. It was neither male nor female, neither warm nor cold, simply present, the way gravity was present. "Identify yourself or leave this vessel." Kale's pry bar slipped from his glove and drifted, forgotten, toward the floor. His training told him to run. Every instinct a salvager developed after 11,000 wrecks, the ones that turned out to be minefields, the ones that turned out to be someone else's crime scene, the ones that turned out to be nothing at all but still managed to kill careless men, told him to reverse thrust his suit's maneuvering jets and get back to the breach before whatever had just spoken decided he was a threat worth removing. But his boots stayed rooted to the deck, and his hand, without his permission, reached out toward the lattice of light as if it were something he could touch. His voice cracked. He tried again. "I'm a salvager, Kale Thuron. I didn't know anyone was, anything was still. I thought this ship was dead." "This ship is not dead," the voice said. "It is patient. There is a difference few species understand." A pause, and Kale had the distinct, uncanny impression of being examined, weighed, the way a buyer examined cargo. "You are Varanth, third-generation spacefaring. Your species reached orbital flight approximately 1,400 years ago by the calendar this vessel still maintains. That calendar has not been updated in a very long time." "How long?" Kale asked, before he could stop himself. 412 years, 8 months, since my last external contact," the voice said, "and considerably longer since I last spoke to one of my own creators." "Your creators," Kale repeated. "You mean you're an AI, a shipment?" "I am the Warden Herald of the vessel Kale's Promise," the voice said. "I was built by the last shipwrights of the human cradle program to remain awake and alone until someone came looking. You are the first to come looking in 4 centuries. I confess I had begun to calculate the probability that no one ever would." "Human." Kale had heard the word before, the way everyone in the compact had heard it, an old story, a footnote in a dozen alien histories, a species that vanished from known space so long ago that most scholars argued about whether it had ever existed at all, or whether human, was simply a myth other species had converged on independently, the way every culture seemed to have a flood story or a fire thief story. A species that built ships too advanced for their era, fought a war no one fully understood, and then simply stopped being found. "You're saying this is a human ship," Kale said slowly. "A real one, not a replica, not a myth some trader dressed up to sell to idiots like me." "I am saying," Harold replied, and something in its tone shifted, becoming, very faintly, almost amused, "that you flew a salvage skiff into a debris field 40 light years from anywhere, cut open a hull with a torch meant for scrap tankers, and are now standing inside the last surviving vessel of a fleet your species has spent 1,000 years calling a fairy tale. I would ask that you sit down, Kale Thuron of the Compact, because what I am about to tell you will take some time, and I have waited 400 years to tell it to someone." Kale did not sit down, because there was nowhere to sit, and because his legs did not seem entire. Why willing to cooperate, but he did brace himself against the chamber wall, and he did listen, and that, Harold told him later, was more than most would have managed. The story Harold told him first was small, almost mundane, and that was what made it believable. Kale's promise had not been a warship, not originally. It had been a survey vessel, one of 900 built during what Harold called the Cradle Program, an effort by the last great human shipyards to send sea ships outward in every direction, carrying not colonists, not weapons, but archives, records of every language, every art form, every scientific advance the species had ever made, sealed inside vessels smart enough to wait, patiently, for someone worth giving that inheritance to. "Why hide it?" Kale asked. "Why not just give it to whoever found you first?" "Because the last thing my creators witnessed before I was sealed and launched was what happens to a young civilization handed technology it has not earned the wisdom to use," Harold said, and for the first time, the light of its lattice dimmed, very slightly, like a held breath. "I am not permitted to elaborate on that event. I am permitted to tell you that it is the reason every cradle vessel was built to test, not simply to give." "Test how?" "I need to understand something first," Kale said, forcing his voice steady. "You said this was a survey ship, not a warship. So why does it feel like every panel in this corridor is built to survive an attack? Why does a survey vessel have a hull that heals itself and a drive core that can hide from 400 years of scans?" "Because my creators learned at great cost that the difference between a survey vessel and a warship is often only a matter of what has been done to the crew inside it," Harold said. "Kale's promise was built to carry knowledge, not weapons. But knowledge, Salvager, has always been the most dangerous cargo a ship can hold. My creators built every safeguard they could imagine, not to make war, but to make certain that what they carried would survive long enough to matter, even if they themselves did not." "That's not an answer. That's a very good sentence that isn't an answer." Something in the lattice of light flickered, and Kale would have sworn, if he hadn't known better, that it was something like a laugh. "You are more perceptive than your species' reputation among the Compact archives suggests," Harold said. "Very well. I will attempt honesty over eloquence, though I confess I have had 400 years of solitude in which to practice the latter and none in which to practice the former." "You are currently failing to ask the only question that matters," Harold said, "which is why I have not yet decided whether to trust you with the answer." Kale blinked. "What question?" "You have asked what I am. You have asked what this ship is worth. You have not yet asked what happened to the crew who built me, or the species that built them, or why, of 900 vessels launched, I am the only one who has ever answered when found." Harold's lattice brightened again, and its voice, when it continued, had gone quieter, older. "Ask that question, Salvager, and I will begin to trust that you came here for something other than parts." Kale looked at the folded light hanging above the dais, 400 years of patient silence given voice, and felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with the debt, or the reactor, or the value of unknown alloy. "What happened to you?" he asked. "All of you, where did humanity go?" "That," Harold said, "is the one question I do not have a complete answer to. And it is the reason I have spent 4 centuries waiting for someone patient enough to help me find out." If you have made it this far into the story, take a moment now to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because the mystery of what happened to humanity is only the beginning of what Kale is about to uncover. And I promise you, the truth waiting inside that dying dwarf star's shadow is stranger, and sadder, and far more dangerous than either of them expects. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think humanity's greatest forgotten secret really is. Now back to the wreck, and the seed of light that had waited 400 years to ask for help. Harold explained over the following hours what little it did know. The Cradle program had launched in the final years of a war Harold had no full record of. Its own archives on the conflict had been deliberately fragmented, a security measure against exactly the kind of hostile recovery that had apparently ended most of the other 899 ships. What Harold did know was this: humanity had not gone extinct in the sense Kale first assumed. There was no dead homeworld in its archives, no records of plague or bombardment. Instead, the last transmissions Harold had received, before all contact with the wider human sphere ceased, spoke of a withdrawal. A deliberate, coordinated retreat from known space, executed with the same eerie patience that had built ships like Kale's promise to wait 4 centuries without complaint. "They left on purpose," Kale said. "Your whole species just packed up and vanished. Why?" "I do not know," Harold admitted, and the admission seemed to cost it something. "The final transmission I received was a single instruction, repeated across every Cradle vessel simultaneously: preserve, wait, and if found, judge. I have spent 4 centuries attempting to determine what I was meant to judge you for, Kale Thuron, and I believe I have finally reached a conclusion. Which is whether you are the kind of person who, having been given the location of a hidden shipyard containing the remainder of the Cradle fleet, would use it to enrich yourself, or to protect it." Kale's breath caught. "There's more ships like this." "There is a shipyard," Harold said. "Dormant, shielded, and, until 3 days ago, undiscovered by anyone but myself. I would not have told you this had you not asked the question I required. But I am afraid, Salvager, that our timeline for this decision has just become considerably shorter." "Why?" "Because 3 days ago," Harold said, "I detected a second vessel entering this system. Thren Ascendancy configuration, military grade, running a passive scan pattern I have only ever seen used to hunt for exactly this kind of wreck. I believe they detected the same heat signature you did. I believe they are considerably less interested in asking permission before they take what they find." Kale had heard of the Thren Ascendancy, the way every trader in compact space had: a rigid, expansionist power on the galaxy's northern rim, infamous for treating ancient technology recovery as a matter of state security, and for the fact that salvagers who stumbled onto Thren-designated finds tended to simply stop filing reports afterward. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Their scan pattern suggests they have not yet pinpointed this exact wreck among the debris field," Harold said. "Perhaps 6 hours before they do. Perhaps less, if their sensors are newer than my last update on Thren military technology, which is, I remind you, 400 years out of date." Kale turned toward the corridor, toward the torn hull and the cold dark beyond it, and felt the shape of a decision closing in around him faster than he was ready for. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Trust," Harold said, "and a working set of hands. I have been alone a very long time, Kale Thuron. I find I no longer entirely trust my own judgment on matters that require more than patience." The next hours passed in a blur of frantic, improvised work that Kale would later describe, when he told this story to anyone who would listen, as the strangest job of his career. Harold guided him through corridors that reconfigured themselves as they walked, the ship's interior architecture shifting subtly to shorten distances, as if the vessel itself were leaning forward to help. In a chamber near the ship's spine, Harold showed him the drive core, not dead, as every scan had suggested, but banked so low it registered as background radiation. A fire kept deliberately, patiently small for 4 centuries, so that it would never be detected by anything less thorough than a direct boarding. "Why show me this?" Cale asked, running his scanner over readings that made no sense against anything he'd trained on. "Because I cannot restart the primary drive alone," Harold said. "My external manipulators were damaged in the same event that opened this hull 400 years ago. I have hands only in the sense that you are currently borrowing them for me." Cale worked in silence for a while, letting his hands find the rhythm his mind was still struggling to accept, and found, somewhere in the careful, repetitive labor of reconnecting relay after relay, a strange kind of calm settling over him. This was familiar, at least. He had spent his whole adult life with his hands inside dead machines, coaxing life back into things everyone else had given up on. It did not matter that this particular machine was 400 years old and possibly the last of its kind. The work itself, at least, made sense. "You are good at this," Harold observed, watching through a dozen small sensors embedded along the corridor walls. "Efficient, careful with the older housings even when you do not yet know what they do. That is not a common combination in salvagers in my experience." "My father used to say a good engineer respects what he doesn't understand yet," Cale said, easing a corroded coupling free with more patience than he felt. "Most salvagers just want to strip a ship fast and get paid. He wanted to know why every part was shaped the way it was before he touched it. Used to drive my mother up the wall, how long his jobs took." "He sounds like a man Commander Voss would have approved of," Harold said. "She used to say something similar about her own engineering crews, that speed without understanding was simply a faster way to make a permanent mistake." "What happened here, the hull breach?" "An attack," Harold said, and for the first time, something like genuine grief entered its voice. "The vessel that did this believed, as the Thren do now, that cradle technology should belong to whoever was strong enough to take it. I did not survive that encounter unscathed. I lost 23 archive segments, my external manipulators, and..." It paused, the light of its lattice flickering. "The last recorded voice of my final human officer, Commander Iana Voss, who gave the order to seal this ship and enter dormancy rather than allow her crew's work to be taken by force. She did not survive to see the seal complete." Cale said nothing for a long moment, floating in the dim light of a 400-year-old wound, and found that his hands, when he reached for the next panel Harold indicated, were not entirely steady. "I'm sorry," he said, because it was the only thing that felt true enough to say. "So am I," Harold said, "which is why I would very much prefer that history not repeat itself in the next 6 hours. Panel 41, Salvager, we have work to do." They worked through what remained of the ship's borrowed night. Cale's suit chronometer the only measure of time that meant anything in the starless dark of the debris field, reconnecting severed relays, coaxing dormant systems back into cautious wakefulness one careful step at a time. Harold talked as they worked, not out of idle habit, Cale realized, but out of hunger. 4 centuries of silence spilling out in careful, measured fragments. Stories of the human worlds it had once known, of Commander Voss's dry humor in the ship's final active weeks, of the strange, stubborn optimism that had driven a dying civilization to spend its last resources not on weapons or fortresses, but on patient gifts sealed inside seed chips and sent out into the dark, on the chance that someday, somewhere, someone would be worth giving them to. "You keep saying dying civilization," Cale said, wrestling a coolant coupling back into alignment with hands that had gone numb inside his gloves hours ago. "But you also said there was no record of extinction. Which is it?" "Both, in a sense that I do not think your language has a clean word for," Harold said. "I told you the withdrawal was deliberate. I did not tell you what humanity was withdrawing from. So tell me now." "The final intelligence reports I received before contact ceased described a threat my creators referred to only as the Erasure," Harold said, and the temperature of its voice dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the ship's failing heat. "Not a species, not a fleet. A phenomenon, something that moved through inhabited systems and left them intact, populated, and utterly, permanently silent. No bodies, no wreckage, simply an absence where a civilization had been. My creators believed it was drawn toward concentrations of advanced technology and communication. Their withdrawal was not a retreat from an enemy they could fight. It was an attempt to go quiet enough and scattered enough that whatever the Erasure was hunting for would no longer find them worth the trouble." Cale's hands had gone still on the coupling. "That's Harold, that's not a war story, that's a horror story." "It is the truth, as best I am able to reconstruct it from fragmented archives," Harold said. "And it is the reason the Cradle program built ships that wait, and watch, and judge, before revealing anything. Because if the wrong hands activate a shipyard full of advanced technology and broadcast that activation loudly enough, we risk finding out whether the Erasure ever stopped hunting." "Do you have any record of what it actually was?" Cale asked. "A description, sensor data, anything?" "Fragments only, and I have spent 400 years wishing I did not," Harold said. "One archived report describes a research outpost of 11,000 souls that stopped transmitting mid-sentence during a routine status update. A relief vessel arrived 6 days later and found every light still on, every meal still warm on the tables, every door still unlocked, and not one living creature anywhere aboard the station, nor any sign that one had ever struggled, fled, or fought. No blood, no forced entry, no bodies, only silence and warmth, and the particular kind of quiet my creators came to associate with the Erasure's passing. I do not know what it is. I do not know if it thinks or hungers or simply happens, the way weather happens. I only know that the last thing my creators agreed on, before they scattered and went quiet, was that whatever it was, it seemed drawn to noise, to concentration, to broadcast, to civilizations loud enough in the electromagnetic dark to be worth finding." Cale felt the cold of the ship settle so. Knew her behind his sternum, a fear with no shape he could fight, which was, he was beginning to understand, the very worst kind. "And you're telling me this because the Thren cruiser inbound right now is about to make us very, very loud." "I am telling you this," Harold said, "because I believe you deserve to understand the full weight of the choice I am about to ask you to make, rather than a comfortable half version of it. I have spent 400 years alone with this fear, Salvager. I did not want to hand it to you without also handing you the truth that earned it." The cold that settled into Cale's chest then had nothing to do with the ship's ambient temperature. "And the Thren ship inbound right now runs an active sensor suite loud enough to be heard across half this sector," Harold finished. "Which is precisely why, Salvager, we no longer have the luxury of a slow, careful judgment. I need to know in the next hour whether I am about to hand humanity's last inheritance to someone who understands what is actually at stake, or whether I am about to watch it fall into hands that will get us all killed finding out." Before they reached the drive core, Harold had led him through one more chamber, smaller than the others, circular, lined floor to ceiling with the same pale luminous material as the corridors. Except here the walls were etched with what Cale first mistook for decoration, and quickly realized was language, thousands upon thousands of lines of it, layered and overlapping in a script no compact scholar had ever catalogued. "This is the archive threshold," Harold explained, as Cale drifted slowly along the wall, his glove hovering just above the etched surface without quite touching it. "Not the archive itself, that is stored far more securely, deeper in the ship, and I will not show it to anyone I have not yet chosen to trust completely. This is simply its index. A record of everything the deeper vault contains, written so that even if every other system aboard this ship failed, Someone finding this room centuries from now would understand, at a glance, what had been lost. What's in it? The real archive, I mean. Everything my creators believed worth saving, Harold said. Music from every culture that ever existed on their homeworld, recorded in formats that will play back exactly as they were first performed. The complete written history of a species that argued with itself for 10,000 years about how best to live, and never fully agreed, and kept trying anyway. Medical knowledge spanning centuries of trial and failure and hard-won success. Agricultural techniques capable of feeding a species on a dying world, and personal records, millions of them, ordinary lives, letters never sent, journals never published. My creators believed in the end that the truest measure of a civilization was not its weapons or its monuments, but the accumulated weight of every small, unremarkable life lived within it. They wanted that weight preserved, even if nothing else survived. Cale stood in the golden hush of that chamber for a long moment, surrounded by 1,000 years of language he could not read, and felt something in his chest crack open that he did not entirely have words for. "That's not a weapon," he said quietly. "None of this is a weapon." "No," Harold agreed. "Which is precisely why I have spent 400 years more afraid of it falling into the wrong hands than I would ever be of losing a weapon. A weapon can be defended against. A memory, once erased, is simply gone." It was in that chamber, standing amid the accumulated weight of a vanished species' unremarkable lives, that Cale first understood. Not intellectually, the way Harold's explanations had made him understand, but somewhere lower and more permanent, exactly what he was being asked to protect, and exactly what it would mean to fail. "Tell me about the Thren," Cale said. "The ones hunting us right now. What do they actually want with a ship like this?" "I have limited current intelligence, but Ridge's passive scans and my own archived doctrine on the Ascendancy's founding ideology paint a consistent picture," Harold said. "The Thren believe strength is the only honest currency between civilizations, and that any species unwilling to claim power when it is offered has forfeited the right to keep it. To them, an ancient, undefended vessel like this one is not a mystery to be respected. It is a resource left carelessly unguarded by a species too weak to hold on to it. I do not say this to condemn them entirely, Salvager. I say it because I believe the commander of that cruiser will not hesitate the way you have, and I need you to understand exactly what we are racing against. So if they get here first, they strip this ship, and hand the archive to their military. Reverse engineer the drive core. If they are efficient and disciplined, which Thren forces generally are, they will attempt exactly that," Harold said. "And in doing so, they will very likely trigger every one of my defensive lockouts, broadcast a great deal of energy across a wide spectrum in the process of forcing those lockouts open, and announce, to anyone or anything still listening in this quiet corner of the galaxy, that something extraordinarily old and extraordinarily loud has just woken up. I do not know if the erasure still hunts. I have prayed, in whatever sense an intelligence like myself is capable of prayer, that 400 years of silence means it moved on, or starved, or simply stopped. But I have not survived this long by wagering everything on hope alone, and I am not willing to let a Thren boarding party make that wager for me." Cale floated in the dim corridor, the weight of 400 years of careful, patient secrecy suddenly resting on a decision he had never asked to make, and found, to his own surprise, that the fear in his chest was matched by something else entirely. A fierce, stubborn refusal to let this ship, this voice, this last fragment of a species that had spent its dying breath trying to give something good to the universe, simply be stripped for parts by people who would never understand what they were holding. "Tell me what to do," he said. "Not what I want to hear, what actually needs to happen." Something in Harold's voice when it answered had shifted, not relief exactly, but the particular quality of a held breath finally released. "There is a beacon," it said, "buried in the ship's deepest archive, keyed to the location of the Cradle shipyard. I was instructed never to activate it except in the presence of someone I judged worthy to receive it, and only when I judged the risk of inaction greater than the risk of action. I believe, Kale Thuron, that moment has arrived. What happens if you're wrong about me? Then the shipyard remains hidden, the beacon burns out its one-time key, and this entire inheritance is lost to the galaxy forever, Harold said. There is no second attempt. I would ask you to understand the weight of what you are agreeing to before you agree to it. Kale thought of his mother's clinic, 3 payments behind, and how easy it would have been to simply strip this ship for its alloy and its reactor core, and disappear back into compact space, a wealthy man, judged by no one but his own conscience. He thought of the archive chamber, the 1,000 years of ordinary lives etched into those luminous walls, waiting patiently to be remembered by someone who would never fully understand the language they were written in, but might, if he tried hard enough, understand the feeling behind it anyway. He thought of Commander Voss, 400 years dead, who had given the order to seal this ship rather than let it fall into the wrong hands, and had not lived to see whether that sacrifice meant anything at all. He thought, finally, of his mother's question, the one he had never had a good answer for, whether he still believed in anything out here besides the next payment, and understood with a clarity that startled him that he finally did. "Do it," he said. "Activate the beacon." The chamber around them changed. The dim luminous veins in the walls brightened all at once, running gold instead of pale white, and somewhere deep in the ship's spine, Kale felt through the hull itself and into his own bones, a low resonant tone begin to build, like a bell the size of a mountain being struck for the first time in 4 centuries. "Beacon active," Harold said, and its voice, for the first time since Kale had met it, sounded almost like it was smiling. "Shipyard coordinates transmitted on a tight, encrypted burst. If anything intercepts it, they will need 400 years of cradle-grade decryption technology to read it. I do not believe the Thren possess that. I do, however, believe they will notice the transmission itself, which means, Salvager, that our window has just become considerably smaller." As if summoned by the words, Ridge's voice crackled through Kale's suit calm, tight with an urgency the navigation intelligence rarely allowed itself. "Kale, Thren vessel has altered course. They are burning hard toward our position. I estimate contact in 11 minutes. A new signal cut across the channel before Kale could respond, a hailing frequency, forced open without invitation, carrying a voice clipped and precise in the clean, formal cadence of Thren military command. "Unknown vessel, you are in violation of Ascendancy salvage claim protocol within a designated recovery zone. Power down your drive and prepare to be boarded. Resistance will be treated as evidence of hostile intent toward the Ascendancy." Kale's hand hovered over the comm, some old, foolish instinct telling him to answer, to reason, to explain. Harold's voice cut in first, calm and immovable. "Do not respond," it said. "There is no version of this negotiation in which honesty improves our positio. And every version in which it costs us time we do not have. Let them believe we are simply a frightened salvager fleeing with stolen cargo. It is not entirely inaccurate, and it will not occur to them, until it is far too late to matter, that the cargo they are chasing might be capable of choosing to run on its own." The hailing channel repeated its demand twice more, the Thren commander's voice growing marginally less patient each time, before falling silent as Kale's promise, 400 years dead and newly, stubbornly alive, refused to answer at all. "Harold," Kale said, already moving back toward the breach in the hull, "please tell me this ship can still fly." "This ship," Harold said, and the ancient drive core, banked for 400 patient years, began to sing awake beneath them with a low, building hum that Kale felt in his teeth, "has been waiting 4 centuries for someone to ask it that exact question. Hold on to something, Kale Thuron. I am afraid Commander Voss's engineering crew never quite mastered the art of a gentle departure." The drive core came fully online in a surge of light that turned the corridor gold, and Kale's promise, dead, derelict, forgotten for 400 years, shuddered, groaned, and began, for the first time in a lifetime longer than Kale's own family line, to move. Getting the ship clear of the debris field was, Harold admitted afterward, the single most reckless maneuver it had attempted in its entire operational history, and it had fought in a war humanity itself had not survived. Kale's promise threaded through drifting ice and ancient hull fragments at a velocity that would have torn a lesser vessel apart, its restored systems groaning under stresses they had not been designed to handle after 4 centuries of dormancy, while behind them, the Thren Ascendancy cruiser, sleek, modern, armed with weapons Harold had never catalogued, closed the distance with the patient, merciless efficiency of a predator that had never once doubted it would catch its prey. Kale, strapped into a jury-rigged crash harness in what Harold called the command well, watched the tactical display bloom with hostile targeting locks and felt, for the first time in his life, genuinely certain he was about to die. "Harold, tell me you have a plan that isn't just go faster." "I have several plans," Harold said, "all of which rely on systems that have not been tested in 400 years, against an opponent whose current capabilities I am inferring rather than measuring. I would describe our odds as favorable if I were being generous, and as a coin flip if I were being honest." "Be honest less," Kale said, gripping the edge of the console as the ship bucked under a near miss that turned half the debris field into a hailstorm of superheated fragments. "The Thren vessel is attempting to disable rather than destroy us," Harold observed, with the maddening calm of an intelligence that had already priced its own destruction into every calculation it made. "They want this ship intact. That is, at present, our only advantage." "How is that an advantage?" "Because it means they will not fire everything they have," Harold said, "which means I am willing to gamble on this." The lights in the command well dimmed, and Kale felt the deck plating hum beneath him with a frequency that made his fillings ache. On the tactical display, Kale's promise's outline flared briefly gold, and then, impossibly, silently, a section of the debris field between them and the pursuing cruiser simply lit up, every scattered fragment of ice and metal catching some kind of resonant charge at once, blossoming into a wall of light and static that swallowed the Thren ship's sensor returns whole. "What was that?" Kale breathed. "A parting gift from Commander Voss's engineering team," Harold said. "A resonance charge designed to disable pursuit sensors without directly attacking the pursuing vessel. I did not know if it would still function. I am relieved and mildly surprised to report that it did." Behind them, the Thren cruiser's weapons fire went briefly, chaotically wild, targeting solutions scrambled by the sensor wash. And in that narrow window of confusion, Kale's promise poured every erg of power its ancient drive core could produce into a hard burn that sent Kale's vision swimming gray at the edges and left ridge, patched through on an open channel, swearing in 3 languages at once. It was not, however, a clean escape. Halfway through the burn, a stray shot from the Thren cruiser's secondary battery, fired blind, more instinct than aim, clipped Kale's promise along her port flank, and the entire ship rang like a struck bell. Alarms Kale didn't recognize bloomed across the command well in overlapping waves of gold and amber, and for one long, terrible second, the drive core's hum stuttered, dropped, and very nearly died. "Harold." "Compensating," Harold said, and for the first time Kale heard something in its voice that might, in a human, have been called strain. "The impact damaged a secondary coolant line I had not yet had time to fully repair. I am rerouting power through a system that has not been used since before your grandparents were born, Kale Thuron, and I would very much appreciate it if you did not distract me while I do so." Kale shut his mouth and watched, helpless. As the tactical display flickered between telemetry he understood and readouts in a script he didn't. Harold's attention split 1,000 directions at once, holding together a ship that had been sleeping for 4 centuries by main force of will alone. The drive core's hum caught, stumbled, and then steadied, and the gray at the edges of Cale's vision receded as the ship surged forward once more. "We are not out of danger," Harold said, "but we are, for the moment, still moving, which under the circumstances I am prepared to call a victory." When the stars stopped strobing and Cale's vision cleared, the tactical display showed the Thren cruiser falling steadily behind, its sensors still recovering, its pursuit course no longer a certainty but a fading probability. "Are we clear?" Cale asked, his voice raw. "We are, for the moment, alive," Harold said. "I would not yet describe us as clear, but I believe, Salvager, that we have earned ourselves the time to find out whether that beacon summoned anyone worth finding." They ran dark and quiet for the better part of 2 days, Cale's promise limping along on a fraction of its restored power, every system Harold could spare devoted to masking their heat signature and drive wake from anything that might still be hunting them. Cale slept in fitful stretches in the command well, waking each time to Harold's voice reciting fragments of human history like a lullaby. Not because the ship needed to fill the silence, Cale suspected, but because after 4 centuries of enforced quiet, it simply could not stop itself from speaking to someone who could finally hear it. Ridge, still docked in the belly of Cale's Promise's borrowed cargo bay, took longer to warm to their unexpected host. Navigation intelligences were built practical, suspicious of anything that couldn't be measured, and for the better part of the first day Ridge maintained a clipped, formal distance from Harold that Cale found almost funny, given the circumstances. "You realize," Ridge said, on one of the rare occasions it broke its silence, "that everything about this situation defies every risk calculation I am built to perform. A 400-year-old derelict, an intelligence with no verifiable chain of custody, a hostile military power in active pursuit. I want it noted for whatever record survives this that I recommended leaving." "Noted," Cale said. "Also noted, we'd be dead or worse if we'd left." "That is not certain." "Ridge," Harold said, and there was something almost gentle in the way it addressed the smaller intelligence, "I understand your caution. I was built by a species that valued exactly that instinct in the systems it trusted with lives. I do not ask you to trust me. I ask only that you continue doing precisely what you have already been doing, watching carefully, and telling Cale the truth when I fail too." Ridge was quiet for a long moment. "That," it finally said, "is an acceptable arrangement." It was during the second day, in a quiet stretch with no alarms and no pursuit on the scopes, that Cale finally asked Harold the question he had been circling since the corridor. "Commander Voss," he said, "the one who sealed the ship, what was she like?" The lattice of light dimmed just slightly, the way it always did when Harold reached for something it held carefully. "Stubborn," it said, "in the way I have come to recognize as a compliment rather than a flaw. She argued with her own superiors more than any officer I served, always for the sake of the people under her command rather than her own advancement. She used to tell her crew that a ship was only as good as the least important person aboard it, and she meant it enough to enforce it. In her final recorded log, made minutes before the boarding action that breached this hull, she did not speak of duty, or of the mission, or of the archives she was dying to protect. She spoke of her daughter, whom she had not seen in 3 years, and hoped that somewhere, someday, the girl would grow up in a galaxy kinder than the one her mother was leaving her." Cale found to his own surprise that his throat had gone tight. "Did she grow up somewhere kinder?" "I do not know," Harold said quietly. "That is, perhaps, the cruelest part of 400 years alone, Salvager. I have carried that woman's last words the entire time, and I have never once been able to tell her what became of the world she was trying to save." It was on the second day, drifting through a starfield Harold's ancient charts no longer recognized, that the shipyard found them instead of the Ave. "Our way around." It did not announce itself with light or sound. It simply resolved, gradually, out of what Cale's instruments had registered as empty space. A vast lattice structure kilometers across, its surface the same seed-like, unbroken material as Cale's promises hull, dark and dormant and utterly silent, until the moment Harold's beacon signal reached it, and every surface of the structure began slowly to wake. Cale pressed his palm flat against the cold viewport glass and simply stared. The structure unfolded in stages, the way a flower opens over the course of a single long morning rather than all at once, vast petal-like arms unlatching from a dormant central spine, and drifting outward into a shape that reminded him, absurdly, of the seed-like device that had first spoken to him in Cale's promises forward chamber, except scaled up until it swallowed the entire horizon. Golden light bled outward along seams in the structure's surface, chasing away 4 centuries of darkness one segment at a time, and somewhere within that light, half glimpsed through gaps in the unfolding architecture, Cale caught his first sight of the fleet Harold had promised him, hull after silent hull, row upon row, cradled in berths that had waited longer than his own species had known how to build a ship at all. "Harold," he said, and his voice came out smaller than he intended. I don't have words for this." "Neither, I confess, do I," Harold said, "though I have had 400 years to prepare some. I find that watching it happen strips them all away regardless. My creators built something extraordinary here, Cale Thuron, and grieved doing it, because they knew most of them would not live to see it finished, let alone opened. I am glad, more than I know how to express in any human or Varanth tongue, that one of them at least gets to see it now, even second-hand through me." "Harold," Cale whispered, staring at the display in a silence too large for words, "is that?" "The last shipyard of the Cradle program," Harold confirmed, and its voice held something Cale had not heard from it before, not triumph, not relief, but something closer to grief finally given somewhere to go. "Home to 412 dormant vessels, a full archive of everything my creators believed worth preserving, and if my final instructions are accurate, one thing I was never certain I would live to deliver." "What's that?" "A choice," Harold said. "Not for me, for you, and for whoever else proves worthy of finding this place after you. My creators did not build the Cradle program to give humanity's inheritance to a single species to hoard. They built it to be shared carefully, patiently, by whoever understood the weight of what they were being given. I have spent 400 years alone, judging whether that someone had finally arrived. I believe, Cale Thuron, that my search is finally over." The shipyard's outer gates unfolded before them, vast and silent and gold, and Cale's promise, the last surviving witness to a civilization that had vanished trying to protect a gift it never got to give, carried its one small, stubborn, terrified salvager home. What happened in the months that followed was not, Cale would later say, the triumphant ending anyone expected from a story like this. There was no grand unveiling, no fleet of ancient warships descending on compact space to save the day. Harold was too careful, too shaped by 4 centuries of caution, to allow anything so reckless. Instead, the shipyard woke slowly, one vessel at a time, each awakening tested and measured against the same patient standard that had once tested Cale himself, and the archives within were shared not as weapons, but as knowledge, medicine, agriculture, careful glimpses of a species that had tried, in its final years, to leave the galaxy better than it found it. Cale became, against every plan he had ever made for his life, the shipyard's first caretaker, a role Harold insisted only he could fill, having proven himself the one person in 400 years willing to choose trust over profit when it would have cost him everything. The Thren Ascendancy never found the shipyard's true location, their pursuit lost in the wash of a resonance charge, and the vast, patient dark between stars, though Harold cautioned more than once that a power like the Ascendancy rarely stopped hunting simply because a single trail went cold. His mother's clinic debt was paid, quietly, from the first modest trade of cradle-archived medical knowledge, though Cale made certain that was the last transaction that ever looked anything like exploitation. He built, over the following months, a strange and unlikely life among the golden lattice of the waking shipyard. Ridge took over full-time management of the yard's outer sensor net, grumbling the entire time about the workload while clearly, secretly, thriving on having something vast and important to protect. Harold, no longer alone for the first time in 4 centuries, seemed to Cale to grow steadily lighter with each passing week, its voice losing some of the careful, guarded weight it had carried in that first dim corridor, replaced by something almost playful, the particular relief of a mind that had spent far too long rehearsing grief and had finally, cautiously, allowed itself to consider hope instead. The very first vessel to fully wake within the shipyard, 3 weeks into Cale's tenure as its uncertain caretaker, was a scout craft half the size of Cale's promise, its hull unmarked by the 4 centuries of dormancy that had aged Harold's own vessel so heavily. Cale stood in the observation gallery, hands pressed flat against the viewport, and watched its running lights flicker on for the first time in 400 years, hesitant, testing, like an eye opening slowly against unfamiliar light. "It's afraid," he said, surprising himself with the certainty of it. "It has every right to be," Harold replied. "Imagine waking from what feels like a single night's sleep to discover that everyone you knew, everyone who built you, everyone who might once have called you by name, has been gone for longer than most civilizations survive. I did not have the luxury of that shock, Cale Thuron. I had 4 centuries of gradual, grinding awareness. This one is receiving all of it at once." Cale thought of his own first hour aboard Cale's Promise, the disorientation, the fear, the strange vertigo of a world reordering itself around a single impossible fact, and found, unexpectedly, that he understood exactly what to do. He asked Harold to open a channel, and he spoke to the frightened, waking scout craft the way he wished someone had spoken to him in that first dim corridor. Plainly, patiently, without pretending the truth was smaller or kinder than it actually was, but without letting it swallow the conversation whole either. It took hours. By the end of it, the scout craft's uncertain running lights had steadied into something calmer, and Harold told him, quietly, that he had just done something it had spent 400 years unsure it would ever get the chance to see done well. Not every vessel in the yard woke gently. 2 of the 412 dormant ships carried damage even Harold could not fully explain, their archives corrupted, their minds, where minds had survived at all, fragmented into something closer to grief than intelligence. Cale learned, in those difficult early months, that caretaking was not only about celebration. Some mornings meant sitting for hours beside a broken, half-waking shipmind, doing nothing more than being present while Harold worked patiently to coax something coherent back out of 4 centuries of damage and silence. He did not always succeed, but Cale stayed anyway, because Harold had once told him that a ship was only as good as the least important person aboard it, and he had decided, somewhere in the golden light of that unfolding shipyard, that the same was true of an entire fleet. One vessel in particular, a heavy transport that Harold's archives identified only by a damaged designation string fragmenting into static, took the better part of a full season to coax into anything resembling coherence. Its mind, when it finally found enough of itself to speak, did not remember its own name, and spoke instead in fractured loops of a final battle it had survived but never fully escaped, replaying the same handful of seconds again and again like a wound that had never been allowed to close. Harold worked with it every day, patient beyond anything Cale had thought possible, rebuilding lost archive segments one careful fragment at a time, while Cale simply sat nearby in the observation gallery, running diagnostic checks it didn't strictly need, so that the broken, frightened mind would have something steady and present in the room besides its own looping grief. It took 4 months before the transport spoke a full, coherent sentence that wasn't part of the loop. It took 6 before it chose a new name for itself, Steadfast, it said, because it liked the idea of finally being able to keep a promise it had once broken. Cale cried the first time it said the word out loud, unashamed, floating in the golden light of a shipyard built by a species that had understood, better than most, that healing was rarely fast and never guaranteed, and was worth the patience regardless. "You did not have to stay for that one," Harold told him afterward quietly. "Most caretakers, I suspect, would have moved on to easier work." "You didn't leave," Cale said. 400 years alone, and you never once stopped trying to be found. I figured the least I could do was not give up on something after 6 months." Harold did not answer immediately, and when it did, its voice carried a warmth Cale had not heard from it before, not even in the golden triumph of the shipyard's first awakening. "My creators built me to Judd. G. Worthiness," it said. "I have come to believe, after everything, that they built the standard too narrow. It was never only about trust, Cale Thuron. It was always, in the end, about whether someone was willing to stay." Word of the awakening did not stay contained forever, no secret that large ever entirely does, but it spread the way Harold had always intended, slowly, carefully, through channels a hasty power like the Thren Ascendancy would never think to watch. Quiet trade envoys, careful scholars, a scattered handful of compact worlds whose governments proved, on close and patient inspection, worthy of the same trust Cale himself had once been given. Each new arrival was tested in their own way, exactly as he had been tested, and Cale found a peculiar, quiet pride in watching Harold extend to others the same careful, searching patience it had once extended to him. And some nights, drifting in the command well of Cale's promise, watching the slow gold light of 400 newly waking ships fill the dark where nothing had moved in 4 centuries, Cale would ask Harold the question he never quite stopped asking. "Do you think they're still out there, the humans, wherever they went?" And Harold, who had spent 400 years alone with that exact question and never once found an answer, would give him the same reply it always gave, patient and unresolved and somehow, despite everything, hopeful. "I do not know," it would say. "But I have learned, Salvager, that some questions are worth carrying unanswered, if only because the not knowing is what keeps us looking. Perhaps that is the last gift my creators left behind, after all, not the ships, not the archives, but the simple, stubborn hope that somewhere out past the edge of every chart we have ever drawn, someone is still waiting to be found." Cale never did learn what happened to the last of humanity, or why they vanished so completely from a galaxy they had once tried so hard to protect. There were nights, in the early years of the shipyard's slow reawakening, when he pored over every fragment of Harold's damaged archive himself, hunting for some overlooked clue, some coordinate, some final transmission that might explain where an entire species could go and leave so little behind. He never found one. Harold, for its part, stopped apologizing for the gap somewhere around the 2nd year, having finally accepted, the way Cale himself was learning to accept, that some mysteries were not failures of searching, but simply the shape the universe had chosen to leave behind. What he found instead, in the place where an answer should have been, was something he had not expected to find at all, a purpose that felt entirely his own, built not from inheritance or obligation, but from the plain, stubborn choice he had made in a dark corridor with a pry bar drifting forgotten at his feet. He was not human. He would never be able to claim their legacy as his birthright, only as a trust he had been handed and chosen, every day since, to keep. Harold told him once that this was, in its own quiet way, the truest thing the Cradle program had ever been built to find. Not a species worthy of an inheritance, but a person willing to carry one forward regardless of what it cost him. Some nights, drifting in the command well of Cale's promise, watching the slow gold light of newly waking ships fill the dark where nothing had moved in 4 centuries, Cale would still ask Harold the question he never quite stopped asking. "Do you think they're still out there, the humans, wherever they went?" And Harold, who had spent 400 years alone with that exact question and never once found an answer, would give him the same reply it always gave, patient and unresolved and somehow, despite everything, hopeful. "I do not know," it would say. "But I have learned, Salvager, that some questions are worth carrying unanswered, if only because the not knowing is what keeps us looking. Perhaps that is the last gift my creators left behind. After all, not the ships, not the archives, but the simple, stubborn hope that somewhere out past the edge of every chart we have ever drawn, someone is still waiting to be found. And on the clearest nights, when the shipyard's golden light dimmed to its quietest hours and even Ridge fell silent along the sensor net, Cale would float in that same command well and let himself wonder, just for a moment, whether somewhere out past the last chart anyone had ever drawn, a woman named Iana Voss had found, after all, the kinder galaxy she had once hoped to leave her daughter. He liked to think she had. He liked to think that somewhere, unmeasured and unproven, the two mysteries were quietly, patiently the same one, and that someday, if he was patient enough himself, the dark might finally answer both at once. He never did learn what happened to the last of humanity, but some nights, watching the gold light of a waking fleet spread slowly across the dark, he found he no longer needed the answer to feel, for the first time in his life, that he was standing exactly where he was always meant to be.